The wind on Veyrath never stopped. It came screaming across the frozen plains like something alive and angry, tearing through fur and bone and anything foolish enough to stand against it. And on this world, the Korvathi had learned a long time ago that only the strong deserve to stand at all. Rin knew this before he knew his own name. He was born the smallest of 4 cubs in the litter of Sayla, a respected hunter of the Iron Ridge pack. And from the moment he drew his first breath, the others could see that something was wrong with him. His left hind leg was twisted at the joint, fused in a way that made it stiff and short. And when his littermates began to walk on all fours within days of birth, Rin could only drag himself forward with a sideways lurch that made the elder females click their tongues and look away. His mother loved him anyway. Sayla would carry him tucked against her chest when the pack moved between hunting grounds, hiding him beneath her thick winter coat so the others could not see how he dangled like dead weight against her ribs. At night, she would curl around him and lick his bad leg, as if her tongue could reshape the bone, and she would whisper to him in the old language that he was strong and that he would prove them all wrong. But Sayla was a hunter and not a fool. She knew what was coming. The Kull judgment came every season when the frost turned black and the moons lined up like 3 pale eyes in the sky. It was the oldest law of the Korvathi, older than memory, older than the first stone cities they had built and abandoned. It said that every cub of walking age must be presented to the pack elders and judged fit or unfit for the life ahead. Those who were fit would be welcomed into the ranks of the pack and given their first name marks carved into the fur behind their ears. Those who were unfit would be declared Vrethkai, a word that translated roughly to return to the waste, and they would be taken to the edge of the scorch expanse and left there without food or water or farewell. The scorch expanse was a desert of cracked stone and radioactive dust that stretched for hundreds of miles to the south. No one who entered it came back. That was the point. Rin was 4 seasons old when his time came. Sayla had spent the last weeks teaching him to hide his limp. She would make him walk in circles inside their den, again and again, correcting his gait, showing him how to shift his weight to his good legs so the bad one barely touched the ground. And by the end, he could almost pass for normal, if you did not look too closely, and if he did not have to walk for very long. But the elders always looked closely. The judgment took place in the Great Circle, a ring of ancient stones at the center of the pack settlement, and every member of Iron Ridge gathered to watch, because it was tradition, and because tradition on Veyrath was not something you questioned. The silence of your own mind. Alpha Dren Voss stood at the center. He was enormous even by Korvathi standards, a mountain of gray-black fur and scarred muscle, who had led the pack for 30 years without challenge. His eyes were the color of old ice, pale and clear, and completely without warmth. And when he looked at a cub during judgment, it was said that he could see all the way down to the marrow of their bones, and know in an instant whether that marrow was strong enough to carry the weight of a Korvathi life. The first 3 cubs of Sayla's litter passed without trouble. They were big and fast, and their legs were straight, and their eyes were bright, and Dren Voss nodded at each one, and the crowd stamped their feet in approval. Then Rin was brought forward. He walked as his mother had taught him, weight shifted, chin high, eyes steady, and for the first 10 steps he almost looked like any other cub. But the great circle was wide, and the ground was uneven. By the 20th step, his bad leg buckled, and he stumbled, and caught himself, and stumbled again, and the silence that fell over the crowd was the loudest thing Rin had ever heard. Dren Voss raised one massive hand. Rin stopped. The Alpha walked toward him slowly, each step deliberate, and crouched down in front of the cub so that their eyes were level. Rin could smell him, the deep musk of authority and age, and he held the Alpha's gaze because his mother had told him never to look away first. Dren Voss reached out and touched Rin's bad leg. Rin did not flinch. The Alpha squeezed the joint gently, feeling the fused bone beneath the fur, and something moved behind his pale eyes. Something that might have been sadness in a species that permitted sadness. But the Korvathi did not permit sadness, and so it passed like a shadow across water, and was gone. Vrethkai, Dren Voss said. The word fell like a stone into still water, rippled outward through the crowd, and somewhere behind him, Rin heard his mother make a sound that he had never heard before. A low, broken keen that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than her throat, from the place where mothers keep the things they cannot say. Two handlers stepped forward. They were young males with blank faces and strong arms, and they lifted Rin between them without roughness, but without gentleness either, the way you might carry a piece of furniture that no longer fit in a room. Sayla lunged. 3 pack members caught her and held her back, and she fought them with everything she had, claws out, teeth bared, howling words that Rin could not make out over the wind. And he twisted in the handler's grip to look at her one last time, and what he saw in her eyes was something he would carry with him for the rest of his life, however long or short that turned out to be. They walked for a long time. The settlement shrank behind them, and the frozen ground gave way to cracked dry earth, and the air grew warmer and tasted like metal, and Rin knew they were approaching the scorch expanse because the plants had stopped growing and the sky had turned from gray to a sick bruised violet. The handlers set him down on the dead ground. They did not speak to him. They did not look at him. They turned and walked away, and their footsteps faded, and then there was nothing but the wind and the dust and the enormous empty silence of a world that had decided he was not worth keeping. Rin stood there for a long time. He did not cry, because Korvathi cubs were taught that tears wasted water, and water was life, and wasting life was the one sin that even the dying were not forgiven for. So instead he turned toward the wasteland, and he started walking. His bad leg dragged, and his good legs ached, and the dust stung his eyes, and the heat pressed down on him like a hand trying to push him into the earth. But he kept moving, because standing still felt like agreement, like admitting that the Alpha was right, that the law was right, that he was nothing, that he deserved this. And Rin, even at 4 seasons old, even limping and alone and terrified in a desert that would kill him by morning, was not ready to agree with that. Not yet. Marin Voss had not spoken to another human being in 731 days. She kept count, not because she was lonely, but because she was a scientist, and scientists measured things, even the things that hurt. And somewhere around day 400, she had stopped feeling the ache of isolation and started feeling something else instead. Something quieter and harder to name, like the sound a house makes when it settles into its foundations and accepts that it is going to stand here for a very long time. Her outpost sat on the far eastern edge of the scorch expanse, a squat, ugly building made of prefabricated panels and stubbornness, half buried in dust and surrounded by sensor arrays that she maintained with spare parts and creative swearing. The Terran Union had built it 6 years ago as a long-range observation post for studying the Korvathi, and Marin had been the lead xenobiologist on the project, the one who spent her days watching the wolf-like aliens through telescopes and drones and learning their language from intercepted communications. When the project ended, the Union ordered everyone home. Marin had looked at her packed bags, and then looked out the window at the violet sky and the endless waste, and the distant shapes of Korvathi hunting parties moving across the frozen plains to the north. And she had unpacked her bags and sat back down at her desk and sent a message to her commanding officer that said simply, no. They had not sent anyone to collect her. They had just marked her file as voluntary non-retrieval and stopped sending supply drops. And that was that. She survived on recycled water from a solar still, protein bars she had stockpiled before the evacuation, and the occasional small reptile she caught in traps outside the outpost. She was thinner than she used to be, and her hair had gone gray at the temples, and her hands were rough and scarred from fixing equipment that was never meant to last this long. But her eyes were sharp, and her mind was clear, and every morning she woke up and checked her sensors, and wrote her observations in a battered notebook, and reminded herself that she was here because she chose to be. On the 732nd day, she found the cub. She was out on a routine sweep, walking a wide circle around the outpost to check the ground sensors for seismic activity, when she saw something that did not belong in the landscape. It was small and dark against the pale, cracked earth, and at first she thought it was a rock or a dead animal. But then it moved, just barely, a twitch of fur and a weak curl of clawed fingers. Marin broke into a run. It was a Corvathi cub, young, maybe 4 or 5 seasons based on his size, and he was in terrible shape. His fur was matted with dust and dried blood, and his left hind leg was swollen to nearly twice its normal size. The skin beneath the fur, hot and tight with infection, looked like he had fallen on something sharp, and the wound was angry and red, and leaking fluid that smelled like copper. His eyes were open, but barely focused, and when Marin knelt beside him, he growled. It was the weakest growl she had ever heard, more breath than sound, but there was real warning in it, real fear, and his cracked lips pulled back to show small fangs that were meant to frighten her away. Marin did not move away. "Hey," she said softly, in Terran Standard, because it did not matter what language she used right now. What mattered was the tone. And her tone was the same one she had used on frightened animals her entire career, low and steady and warm, like a fire you could sit beside without getting burned. "Hey, it is okay, I'm not going to hurt you." The cub growled again, but weaker this time, and his eyes were starting to drift shut, and Marin knew that if she did not act fast, he would die right here on this dead ground, under this ugly sky. And she was not going to let that happen. She shrugged off her thermal blanket and wrapped him in it. He was heavier than she expected. Corvathi were dense-boned, built like small tanks even as children, and lifting him sent a bolt of pain through her lower back that she ignored completely. She held him against her chest, the way she had seen Corvathi mothers hold their cubs, and she turned and walked back toward the outpost. And with every step, she could feel his heartbeat against her ribs, fast and thready and fragile. The outpost was not a hospital, but Marin was resourceful. She cleared her work table and laid him down and pulled out the medical kit she had assembled over the years, a mix of human supplies and improvised tools she had designed for Corvathi biology based on years of remote observation. She had never actually touched a living Corvathi before this moment, and her hands were shaking, but her mind was calm, and she let her training take over. First, flushing it with antiseptic solution that made the cub yelp and snap at her fingers, and she dodged his teeth without flinching and kept working. She applied a broad-spectrum antibiotic paste that she had modified for non-human tissue, and sealed the wound with synthetic skin strips. She set up a fluid line, using a needle she had to file down to penetrate Corvathi hide, and hung a bag of electrolyte solution from a hook above the table. The leg was harder. She scanned it with her portable imager and saw what the problem was. The joint was fused, a birth defect, and the forced march through the wasteland had inflamed the surrounding tissue, until it was a swollen mess of damaged muscle and strained ligaments. This was not something she could fix with a bandage. This needed engineering. Marin sat down at her fabrication terminal and started designing. She worked through the night, pulling up every scan and measurement she had ever taken of Corvathi's skeletal anatomy. Adapting a corrective brace design she had originally created for survey animals with joint injuries. The printer hummed and clicked and spat out components, one by one, and she assembled them with steady hands, while the cub slept fitfully on the table behind her, whimpering in his fever dreams. By dawn the brace was ready, but the cub was not. His temperature had spiked in the night, and he was shivering despite the blanket, and his breathing had gone shallow and fast. Marin pulled a chair beside the table and sat down, and placed her hand on his chest, and felt the rapid flutter of his heart beneath her palm. She did not leave that chair for 14 hours. She monitored his vitals on a cracked datapad that she had to tap twice to refresh. She adjusted his fluid intake when his blood pressure dropped. She cooled his forehead with damp cloths when the fever peaked, and warmed him with her own body heat when it crashed. She talked to him the entire time, a steady, quiet stream of words about nothing and everything, about Earth and its blue oceans, about her sister's garden back in Oregon, about the time she saw a whale breach off the coast of Alaska, and how it was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. She did not know if he could hear her. She talked anyway. On the second morning, the fever broke. Rin opened his eyes, and for the first time, they were clear and focused, and he saw the human sitting beside him. This small, strange creature, with no fur and no claws and no fangs, with dark circles under her eyes and dried sweat on her forehead, and a look on her face that he had no word for in any language he knew. She smiled at him. He did not know what a smile was. The Korvathi did not smile. Their faces expressed dominance or submission, aggression or neutrality, but never this strange soft baring of teeth that somehow meant the opposite of what bared teeth were supposed to mean. But her eyes, warm and tired and kind, and there was something in them that he recognized, even though he had never seen it directed at him before. Something that looked like relief, like she had been afraid he would die, and now that he had not died, she was so grateful that her whole face had changed shape. Marin reached for the canteen beside her chair and held it to his lips. "Drink," she said, and the word was in Terran Standard, but the meaning was universal. Rin drank. The water was cool and clean, and it tasted like nothing he had ever tasted before, because everything he had ever been given in his life had come with a price, with a test, with the unspoken question of whether he was worthy of receiving it. This water came with no question at all. It was simply given, by a creature who had no reason to give it, to a cub that his own people had thrown away, and in that moment, something shifted inside Rin, something small and deep and permanent, like a bone resetting itself into a position it was always meant to hold. He drank until the canteen was empty, and then he looked up at the human, and she was still smiling, and he still did not know what that expression meant. But he knew what it felt like. It felt like being found. The first word Rin learned in Terran Standard was careful. Marin said it every time he tried to stand too fast. Every time he put weight on his bad leg before the brace was fitted. Every time he reached for something on a high shelf and wobbled on his uneven feet. She would say it with her hands out and her eyebrows raised, and her voice pitched in that particular way that meant she was worried, but trying not to show it. And after hearing it 100 times, Rin began to understand that this word was not a command. It was a request. It meant, "I do not want you to be hurt." And that was such a foreign idea that he had to sit with it for several days before it stopped feeling like a trick. The brace changed everything. Marin fitted it on a gray morning when the dust storms had quieted enough for the outpost to feel almost peaceful. She knelt beside him and worked with slow, deliberate hands, adjusting the straps around his leg, checking the alignment against the scans on her datapad. The brace was made of lightweight printed alloy and padded synthetic fabric, and it wrapped around his leg from hip to ankle like a second skeleton. When she finished, she stood back and said, "Try." Rin put his foot down. For the first time in his life, the leg held. Not perfectly. The brace hummed faintly as its microservos compensated for the fused joint, and his gait was still uneven, still different from a normal Corvathi stride, but the pain was gone. The grinding ache that had been his constant companion since birth, that background noise of suffering that he had assumed was simply what it felt like to be alive, was gone. He took a step, then another, then another. He walked across the room and back, and when he turned to look at Marin, she was crying, silently, with her hand pressed over her mouth, and he did not understand why his walking would make her leak water from her eyes, but he was beginning to learn that humans expressed strong feelings in ways that the Corvathi would consider wasteful and strange, and somehow beautiful. The days settled into a rhythm. Marin worked on her research in the mornings, recording observations, maintaining the sensor arrays, writing in her notebook in handwriting that Rin thought looked like tiny insect tracks. The cub would sit nearby and watch her and ask questions, first in broken Corvathi-accented Terran, and then gradually in something closer to real sentences, because Corvathi cubs were built to learn fast, and Rin had a hunger for words that surprised them both. He asked her about Earth constantly. How big, he asked one evening, while she cooked a meal of reconstituted protein and dried vegetables on the small heating plate. Big, she said. Bigger than Veyrath. Much more water. Oceans so wide, you cannot see the other side. Oceans, he repeated, tasting the word. Giant bodies of water, salty. You can swim in them. Why would you go into water on purpose? Marin laughed, and her laugh was another thing Rin had to learn. A sharp, bright sound that meant happiness, even though it sounded almost like a bark of alarm. Because it feels good. Because it is fun. Fun, Rin said, and he filed this word away alongside careful in the growing collection of human concepts that had no equivalent in Corvathi. She told him about hospitals, buildings where sick and injured people were taken and healed regardless of their status or strength. She told him about schools where every child was taught regardless of ability. She told him about laws that protected those who could not protect themselves, laws that were the exact opposite of pack law. Laws that said the measure of a society was not how it treated its strongest members, but how it treated its weakest. Rin listened to all of this with his ears forward, and his head tilted in the way that meant deep concentration, and when she was finished, he said, "Your species protects the ones who slow you down." Yes. Why? Because they are ours. But it makes you weaker. The pack cannot hunt at the speed of its slowest member. This is basic survival. Marin was quiet for a moment. She set down her fork and looked at him with an expression he had come to recognize as her thinking face. The one where her eyes went distant and her lips pressed together, as if she was holding words in her mouth and testing their weight before letting them go. A long time ago, she said, humans lived like that too. We left behind the ones who could not keep up. We let the sick die. We abandoned children who were born different. What changed? We did. Looked at the world we had built, and we did not like it. We decided that survival was not enough if it meant becoming something cruel. We decided that strength was not just about claws and speed, that the strongest thing a person could do was choose to carry someone who could not walk. Rin thought about this for a very long time. He thought about it while he did his walking exercises, circling the outpost perimeter in the brace, while Marin watched from the doorway. He thought about it while he helped her repair a broken sensor array, holding tools in his clawed hands with a delicacy that surprised her. He thought about it at night, when the wind howled outside, and the outpost creaked and groaned, and he lay on the sleeping pad she had made for him, and stared at the ceiling, and felt the absence of pain in his leg, like a phantom, like his body kept reaching for the hurt, and finding nothing there, and not knowing what to do with the empty space. One morning he saw Marin struggling with a water canister. It was heavy, nearly as tall as she was, and she was trying to drag it from the storage area to the filtration unit, and her feet kept slipping on the dusty floor, and her face was red with effort. Rin watched for a moment, and then he limped over and picked it up. It was not easy. His bad leg buckled slightly under the weight, even with the brace, but he steadied himself and carried it to the filtration unit and set it down. And when he turned around, Marin was looking at him with that expression again, the one that was soft and surprised and something else. "Thank you," she said. No one had ever said that to him before. In the Korvathi pack, you did not thank someone for doing what was expected. You hunted because hunting was survival. You carried because carrying was duty. Gratitude implied that the action was a choice, that the person could have chosen not to help and chose to help anyway, and that the choice itself had value. Rin stood very still, and felt the weight of those two words settle into him like stones dropping into deep water. "You are welcome," he said, because Marin had taught him this response, and saying it made something warm bloom behind his ribs that he did not have a name for yet. The nightmares came less often now, but they still came. He would dream of the Great Circle, of the Alpha's cold, pale eyes, of the word Vrethkai falling like an axe, of his mother's howl, and he would wake up snarling and thrashing, with his claws shredding the fabric of his sleeping pad. The first time it happened, Marin had rushed in, and he had nearly slashed her arm open before he knew where he was. After that, she changed her approach. When the nightmares came, she would sit on the floor outside his door, and she would hum, a low, tuneless melody that vibrated through the wall and into his bones. And she would not enter the room, and she would not speak, and she would not ask him if he was okay. She would just sit there and hum until his breathing slowed, and his claws retracted, and the panic drained out of him, like water from a cracked cup. She respected his space. She gave him the room to be afraid, making his fear a burden on her, and this was perhaps the most human thing she ever did for him. This understanding that sometimes the bravest thing you can do for someone is to be close without being too close. One evening a light blinked on the communications console. Marin walked over and read the message, and Rin watched her face change. He had become good at reading human expressions by now, better than most Korvathi would ever be, and what he saw on her face was a complicated thing, a mixture of relief and reluctance, and something that looked almost like grief. "What is it?" he asked. "A Terran Union patrol ship is passing through this system in 6 weeks. They can come and take me home." Home. The word landed between them like a third presence in the room. Rin said nothing. He looked down at his braced leg, and then at the outpost walls that had become the only safe place he had ever known. And then at Marin, who was watching him with those warm, tired, human eyes. She turned back to the console. She did not reply to the message. 2 days later, Rin completed a full walk around the outpost perimeter without stopping. It was not fast, and it was not graceful, and the brace hummed with every step, but he made it all the way around, and when he reached the starting point, Marin was standing there waiting for him, with her arms crossed, and that smile on her face. "Look at you," she said. And for the first time in his life, Rin did not flinch at being looked at, because the eyes looking at him did not see a defect, or a burden, or a violation of law. They just saw him, and that was enough. The sensors picked them up 3 days before they arrived. Marin was running her morning diagnostics when the perimeter array lit up with contacts. Multiple large biological signatures, moving in a tight formation from the north, crossing the border of the scorched expanse at a pace that suggested purpose and not wandering. She stared up a screen and felt something cold settle in her stomach, because she had spent years watching Korvathi movement patterns, and she knew exactly what a hunting formation looked like. "Rin," she called. He was outside doing his morning walk, and he came through the door, with dust on his fur, and his ears already up, because he had heard something in her voice that he had never heard before. Fear. She showed him the screen, and watched his face change. The expressions were subtle. Korvathi faces were not built for the wide range of human emotion. But she had learned to read the small things, the flattening of the ears, the slight widening of the nostrils, the tension in the jaw that meant he was clenching his teeth against words he did not want to say. "Scouts," he said. "Iron Ridge Pack. You can tell from the formation. I can tell from everything. They move the way my mother taught me to read terrain. 3 in front, 2 flanking, 1 trailing to watch for ambush. It is a standard survey party." Why would they come into the expanse? Rin looked at her and said nothing, because they both knew there were several possible answers, and none of them were good. They came on the 3rd morning. Rin saw them first. He was standing at the outpost window and his whole body went rigid, every muscle locked, his claws sliding out involuntarily and clicking against the metal windowsill. Marin came up beside him and looked out and saw 6 Korvathi approaching across the cracked earth. Tall and lean and moving with the fluid predatory grace that still took her breath away, even after years of observation. P. The one in front was larger than the others. P. "Kale," Rin said, and his voice was barely a whisper. "Who is Kale?" "My brother, my littermate, the one who passed the judgment." Marin looked at the approaching figure, and then at Rin, and she reached out and put her hand on his shoulder. A gesture that would have meant nothing in Korvathi culture, but that Rin had learned meant, "I am here," in human. She walked outside to meet them. The 6 Korvathi stopped 20 paces from the outpost door, and Kale stepped forward alone. He was magnificent in the way that all healthy Korvathi were magnificent, tall and broad and thick with muscle, his fur a deep iron gray that gleamed in the harsh light, his eyes the same pale color as Alpha Dren Vos, a family trait that Rin had not inherited. His ears were marked with the carved lines of a full pack member, the name marks that Rin had never received. He looked at Marin the way you might look at an insect that had landed on your food. "Human," he said, and the word was in heavily accented Terran standard, which meant the pack had been studying human language too, which meant they had been paying more attention to Marin's presence than she had realized. "You are the one from the observation post, the one who refused to leave." "I am," Marin said. "You are smaller than our reports suggested." "Most things are." Kale's nostrils flared, and his head turned toward the outpost, and Marin saw the exact moment he caught the scent. Because his entire body changed, the casual predatory confidence replaced by something sharp and electric and deeply unsettled. "That smell," he said. "That is—" The door opened behind Marin. Rin stepped out. The silence that followed was so complete that Marin could hear the dust settling on the ground between them. Kale stared at his brother, and his face went through a rapid series of changes that even Marin's trained eye could barely track. Shock and confusion, and something that looked like revulsion, and something beneath the revulsion that might have been relief, before it was crushed and buried and replaced with a hard, cold mask. "You are alive," Kale said, and it was not a greeting, it was an accusation. "I am," Rin said. "You were declared Vrethkai." "I was." "Then you should be dead. The Waste should have taken you. That is the law." "The Waste tried," Rin said. "Someone disagreed." Kale's eyes moved to Marin, and now the look was not dismissive. It was dangerous. He took a step toward her, and he was so much bigger, nearly 3 times her mass, and his claws were out, long, curved black blades that could open her from throat to hip with a single swipe. "You interfered with the call," he said. "You took a Vrethkai from the Waste and kept him alive. Do you understand what you have done, human? Do you understand the law you have broken?" Marin looked up at him. She had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes, and the height difference was almost comical. This small, soft, clawless creature standing in the shadow of a predator that could end her life in less than a second. But something in her expression made Kale pause. Something he did not expect. She was not afraid. "He is a child," Marin said. I do not recognize any law that kills children. Kale's ears flattened. You do not get to choose which laws you recognize. You are not Korvathi. You are prey. You are Fakren, bearskin, weak and short-lived, and you have no standing to speak on matters of the pack. I have the standing of someone who watched a child almost die and chose to help. That is enough standing for me. Kale snarled and leaned forward, and Marin did not step back, and for a moment the scene balanced on a razor edge, the alien predator and the human scientist, teeth against conviction, size against stubbornness. Then Rin moved between them. He was so much smaller than his brother. He barely reached Kale's chest, and his braced leg made his stance uneven, and he had no weapons, and no training, and no status in the pack. Less than no status. He was Vrethkai. He was supposed to be dead. He was a ghost that had forgotten to disappear. But he stood there anyway, and he spoke in Korvathi, in the old formal register that was used for challenges and declarations, the language of law and honor that he had learned from his mother and never thought he would use. Brother, he said, I will not go quietly. If the pack wants to enforce the cull, then enforce it here. Do it now, in front of the human, in front of your scouts. Let them watch while a scouting party of 6 warriors carries out a death sentence on one lame cub, and then go home and tell the pack how strong you were today. Tell the Alpha how bravely you killed a child half your size. Tell our mother. Kale flinched. It was small, just a twitch of the ears and a flicker in those pale eyes, but Rin saw it, and Marin saw it, and the 5 scouts standing behind Kale saw it too. Tell our mother, Rin said again, and his voice was steady, even though his heart was hammering so hard he was sure everyone could hear it. That you finished what the cull started. Tell her you looked me in the eye, and that I was not afraid. The silence stretched. Kale's claws slowly retracted. His breathing was harsh and fast, and his jaw worked as if he was chewing on something that would not go down. He looked at Rin for a long time, and what passed between them was too complex and too old and too tangled with blood and memory for Marin to fully understand. This is not over, Kale said finally. I will report to the Alpha. He will decide what is to be done with you, both of you. He turned and walked away, and the scouts followed, and they disappeared into the heat shimmer of the expanse, and Rin stood there, watching them go. Were nothing but dark shapes against the violet sky. Marin came up beside him. What did you say to him? She asked softly. I caught some of it, but not all. Rin translated. Marin was quiet for a long time, and then she said, You did not have to do that. Yes, I did. You taught me that. I taught you to stand in front of someone 3 times your size and dare them to kill you. You taught me that some things are worth standing in front of. Marin blinked hard and looked away, and Rin pretended not to notice the water on her cheeks, because he had learned that sometimes the kindest thing you could do for a human was to let them cry without comment. That evening, she sat down at the communications console. The Terran Union patrol message was still there, unanswered, blinking patiently in the corner of the screen. She stared at it for a long time, and then she opened a new channel and began typing. Extraction. She requested diplomatic support. She was going to force a first contact between humanity and the Korvathi, not through military strength or political leverage, but through the only thing she had ever really believed in, the stubborn, unreasonable insistence that one child's life mattered. She sent the message and sat back, and looked across the room at Rin, who was curled on his sleeping pad, with his braced legs stretched out in front of him, and his eyes already closing. We are going to be okay, she said. He opened one eye. You do not know that. No, she admitted, but I have decided to believe it anyway. Rin considered this for a moment, and then he closed his eye, and a sound came from his chest that Marin had never heard a Korvathi make before. A low, rhythmic vibration that resonated through the floor. It sounded almost like a purr. She smiled and turned back to the console, and waited for the universe to answer. The Terran Union sent a frigate. It was a small one, the TUS Quiet Regard, a diplomatic vessel with a crew of 40 and no forward-facing weapons, and it descended through the violet atmosphere of Veyrath like a silver seed falling from an impossible tree. It landed 200 meters from Marin's outpost and sat there humming on the cracked earth, and Rin stared at it from the window and tried to understand how a species that could build something like that had also produced a woman who sat on floors humming lullabies through walls. The diplomatic team was 3 people: Commander Adisa Okafor, a tall, quiet woman with dark skin and calm eyes, who had spent 20 years negotiating with alien civilizations, and who carried no weapon and wore no armor because she believed that the way you arrived at a conversation determined the conversation you would have. Beside her was Dr. Tomas Ruiz, a xenolinguist who spoke 14 alien languages and who shook Rin's hand with a gentleness that suggested he understood exactly how much trust that gesture required. And behind them both, carrying a case of medical supplies and a box of something she called chocolate, was Lieutenant Priya Sharma, who looked at Marin's outpost and Marin's cracked datapad and Marin's improvised surgical tools and said, "You did all of this alone." And Marin said, "Not alone," and looked at Rin. They had 6 days before the Korvathi arrived. Marin used every one of them. She briefed the diplomatic team on everything she knew about Korvathi culture, their hierarchy, their values, their language, the 1,000 small gestures and tonal shifts that could mean the difference between respect and insult. She drew diagrams and made charts and talked until her voice went hoarse. And through all of it, Rin sat beside her and filled in the gaps, explaining the things that no outside observer could know, the feelings behind the rituals, the fears behind the laws. The way Pack Law was not just a set of rules, but a way of seeing the world that had kept the Korvathi alive for 10,000 years, on a planet that was always trying to kill them. "You have to understand," Rin told Commander Okafor on the 3rd evening, speaking in Terran Standard that had grown remarkably fluent over the past months. "The cull is not cruelty for its own sake. The Korvathi believe they are being kind. They believe that a quick death in the waste is better than a slow death of starvation or a life of suffering. They are wrong, but they are not evil. They are afraid." "Afraid of what?" Okafor asked. "Of not being strong enough, of losing, of being the species that went soft and gentle and was swallowed by the cold. They look at their world, and they see a place that punishes weakness, and they have built their entire civilization around making sure they are never weak. And that has worked, and it has also cost them something that they do not have a word for, because they cut it out of themselves. So long ago, they forgot it was ever there. What did they cut out?" Rin looked at Marin. Mercy. The Korvathi arrived on the 7th day. They came from the north in a column of 40, the largest delegation Marin had ever seen outside of a seasonal gathering. Alpha Dren Voss walked at the front, and he was exactly as Rin remembered him, enormous and gray and ancient, his pale eyes scanning the landscape with the patient alertness of a predator who had never in his life been surprised by anything. Until today. The Alpha stopped when he saw the Terran frigate, and his ears went up, and his nostrils flared, and Marin could read the calculation happening behind his eyes. The rapid assessment of threat and opportunity that was as natural to a Korvathi leader as breathing. But the ship was small and unarmed, and the humans standing in front of it were few and soft and carried nothing that looked like weapons. And after a long moment, Dren Voss continued. "Forward." They met in the open ground between the outpost and the frigate. Marin stood with the diplomatic team on one side. Dren Voss stood with his retinue on the other. The wind blew dust between them, and the violet sky pressed down on everything like a bruise. And for a moment, no one spoke, because this was a first contact, and first contacts carry a weight that everyone present could feel. The sense that whatever happened in the next few minutes would echo forward through decades and centuries, and shape the lives of beings not yet born. Commander Okafor stepped forward and spoke in Korvathi, carefully and clearly. The words chosen by Marin, and refined by Rin, and polished by Dr. Ruiz, until they rang with the precise formality that Korvathi culture demanded. She said, "We come with no weapons and no demands. We come because one of our kind found one of your kind in the waste and chose to help, and we are here to stand beside that choice." His expression did not change. "The human broke our law," he said. "The call is sacred. It is what keeps us alive." Marin stepped forward then. She had not planned to speak this early. The diplomatic protocol called for Okafor to lead, but Marin had never been good at protocol, and she had spent more time with the Korvathi than any human alive, and she had something to say that could not wait for proper channels. "Alpha Dren Vos," she said in Korvathi, that was rough and accented, but clear. "I have lived on the edge of your territory for 6 years. I have watched your people hunt and build and raise their young, and I have more respect for the Korvathi than I can express in your language or mine." The Alpha's ears tilted forward, the Korvathi gesture of attention. "I am not here to tell you that your laws are wrong. I am here to ask you one question. Ask. Has any cub declared Vrethkai ever been given the chance to prove the judgment?" Wrong. The silence that followed was deep and textured and alive. Marin could feel the Korvathi delegation shifting behind their Alpha, small movements of ears and tails and feet, and she knew that her question had landed somewhere important, because it was not an attack on pack law, it was a crack in its foundation, a question that the law had never needed to answer, because no Vrethkai had ever survived long enough to ask it. Dren Vos stared at Marin for a long time. "No," he said, "that is the purpose of the call. The judgment is final." "Is it?" Marin said. "Because I would like to introduce you to a judgment that was not final." She turned and looked at Rin. He was standing at the outpost door where he had been watching, and for a moment he did not move. He looked at the Alpha who had condemned him, and at the pack that had thrown him away, and at the brother who had come to finish what the waste had started, and he felt every old fear rise up in him, like a tide. The terror of being seen, of being judged, of being found wanting. Then he looked at Marin, and she did not nod or gesture, or give any signal at all. She just looked at him the way she always looked at him, with those warm, steady human eyes that had never once measured his worth. Rin walked forward. His brace hummed with each step, and his gait was uneven, and every Korvathi in the delegation could see his twisted leg and the alien technology strapped to it. And he knew what they were thinking, because he had thought the same things about himself for his entire life. He stopped in front of Alpha Dren Vos. The Alpha looked down at him, and Rin looked up, and he did not lower his eyes, and he did not drop his ears, and he stood as straight as his body would allow, and the wind blew dust around them both. Dren Vos crouched. He reached out and touched the brace, running his clawed fingers over the metal and the straps and the small humming servos, and his expression shifted in ways that Rin could not fully read. Something complicated and old moving behind those pale eyes. "You walk," the Alpha said. "I walk," Rin said. "The waste should have taken you," the Alpha said. "A human disagreed," Rin said. Dren Vos looked at Marin then, and for the first time his expression held something other than cold authority. It held curiosity, and maybe something deeper, something that looked almost like the beginning of a question he had never thought to ask. He stood. The decision took a long time. He stood motionless for what felt like an age, the wind pulling at his fur, and the entire assembly waited, and Marin held her breath, and Rin held his, and the planet itself seemed to hold its breath. "I will not overturn the cull," Drenvos said finally, and Marin's heart dropped. "But I will say this. This cub was declared Vreth Kai, and the waste did not take him. Something else took him instead, and raised him, and taught him to walk, and brought him back to stand before me without fear." He paused. "There is no law for this. There is no precedent, so I will make one." He placed his massive hand on Rin's head. "I declare this one, Korath Vray, one who walks between, not Pack, not Vreth Kai. Something new, something we do not yet have a name for." A murmur ran through the Korvathi delegation, low and uncertain, and Marin could see that some of them were troubled and some were confused, and a few, just a few, were looking at Rin with something that might have been the first faint stirring of a feeling they had been taught to suppress. It was not the wall coming down. It was a crack in the wall. But Marin was a scientist, and she knew that cracks were how walls fell. Rin chose to stay with Marin. The decision surprised no one. Kale came to him before the delegation departed, and stood in front of his smaller brother, and said nothing for a long time. Forward and pressed his forehead against Rin's, and held it there, a gesture of kinship that predated pack law, that came from somewhere older and deeper than any code or custom. "Mother cried when they told her you were alive," Kale said quietly. "Korvathi do not cry. No, they do not." Kale pulled back and looked at his brother, and something passed between them that needed no translation. And then he turned and followed the pack north, and Rin watched him go and felt a sadness that was also a kind of peace. The frigate left 2 days later, but the diplomatic team left behind a communications relay and a promise that more conversations would follow. Commander Okafor shook Marin's hand and said, "You know you have completely upended the Union's Korvathi strategy." "What was the strategy?" "Avoid them. They are too dangerous." Marin looked at Rin, who was examining the communications relay with intense concentration. "They are not dangerous. They are afraid. There is a difference." The months passed. Marin's outpost grew. A second prefab module arrived on an automated supply drop, then a third. She installed better medical equipment, and a proper fabrication lab, and a water recycling system that did not require daily prayer to function. Rin helped with everything, carrying equipment she could not lift, holding panels in place while she bolted them, translating when the occasional Korvathi trader ventured close enough to the expanse border to see the strange new buildings and the even stranger pair that lived in them. And then one morning, Rin woke before dawn to a sound on the perimeter sensors. He walked to the edge of the outpost and looked out into the gray pre-dawn light, and what he saw made him stop breathing. 2 Korvathi cubs sat on the cracked earth just beyond the sensor line. One was small, with milky, unfocused eyes that stared at nothing. The other was slightly larger and rocked back and forth in a steady rhythm, a self-soothing motion that Rin recognized because he had done it himself in the den when his leg hurt and no one was watching. They were wrapped in furs and huddled together against the cold, and there was no one with them, and no note, and no explanation. But none was needed. Someone, somewhere, a mother or a father or an aunt or a sibling, had heard about the lame cub who survived the waste and the human who had healed him, and they had made a choice in the dark of night that no Korvathi was supposed to make. They had looked at their own imperfect children, and they had decided that pack law was wrong, and they had carried them here and left them and walked away, and that walk home must have been the longest walk of their lives, but also maybe the most honest. Rin turned and went inside. Marin was already awake, standing at the console with a cup of something warm in her hands, and she looked at his face and set the cup down. Asked, too. She did not ask anything else. She pulled on her coat and picked up the medical kit and walked to the door. and Rin fell into step beside her, his brace humming quietly in the morning silence. They walked out together to bring them in. The humans had a saying, Rin had learned, "It takes a village." He did not fully understand it yet, because his idea of a village was a pack that expelled its weakest members, and his idea of belonging was a law that measured your right to exist by the straightness of your bones. But he was beginning to think that maybe a village did not have to look like a pack. Maybe it just had to look like someone who refused to walk away.